Hello, Bio20, and welcome to our lesson on absorption of the small intestine. So today, your learning intention is talking about the different structures that allow for nutrients to pass from the bloodstream into the circulatory system. So although it says you can explain the difference between mechanical and chemical digestion, we've already done all that in the video prior to this. What we're really focusing on today is diagramming the movement of macromolecules into the bloodstream or the lymph glands. So our main goal today is only looking at the small intestine and the absorption of these molecules. We've talked about all the structures that make up the digestive system. Where does food pass through from your mouth to your esophagus, your stomach, how it gets digested even further in the duodenum. Then we said the small intestine to the large intestine. Well, we're going to focus in on that small intestine part after the duodenum. So let's start talking about how do we pass nutrients from our body into our circulatory system or into our bloodstream. You have to remember the whole point of digestion is to get things like amino acids and glucose into our bloodstream so we can pass it to different tissues so that we can do things like cellular respiration or build new proteins. So if we were to look at this picture, this has got a lot going on. What essentially it's showing is the journey of carbohydrates. It starts as a polysaccharide. We know that salivary amylase and pancreatic amylase break it down into some disaccharides. As a disaccharide, we have things like carbohydrases, maltase, sucrase, lactase, that break it down into a monosaccharide. And in our case, we're going to talk about glucose. All of this happens along the digestive tract. Part of this happens in the mouth. Part of this happens in the duodenum. This happens in the duodenum. And now we are going to talk about the jejunum and the ileum, the rest of the small intestine. So as your digested food passes through the rest of your small intestine, what is happening is you have these little tiny villi or little finger-like projections that are covering the intestinal wall cells. Okay, so this is the intestinal wall, the small intestine. And what it does is it's like it's grabbing. So think of your fingers grabbing things. It's literally reaching out and grabbing. It's not physically reaching, but glucose is running past it. It's grabbing that glucose and it's actively, this is key, actively transporting it into the intestinal walls, where then it's actively transported into the bloodstream. Your small intestine is covered with capillaries. Those capillaries then absorb the glucose and take it off to the rest of your body. Amino acids are the same thing. So here's the journey of a protein. A protein is eaten by chewed up in your mouth, no chemical digestion. The first chemical digestion we see is in the stomach with the enzyme of pepsin. Pepsin breaks it into smaller polypeptides. That's what this is, a protein or a polypeptide. Then these peptides get pushed into the duodenum, okay, where we get different enzymes from the pancreas. You get trypsin and chymotrypsin, breaking it into dipeptides. And then shortly after that, the small intestine itself releases peptidases to break it down into amino acids. So this happened in the duodenum. We are now traveling through the jejunum and the ileum with these amino acids. They're passing over the intestinal wall. And we are actively transporting these cells into the bloodstream. So again, this is the same version as glucose. Okay? So when you are passing food from your small intestine to your bloodstream, you're actively transporting it. It's also actively transported from your small intestine. Glycerol and fatty acids, or fats, have a little bit of a different story. So here you have a fat, and we have to emulsify that fat. So that fat is eaten, it's traveled from your mouth to your stomach, it's now in the duodenum. Your liver, okay, produces, your gallbladder stores and releases bile into your small intestine, into the duodenum. That bile emulsifies. So it essentially comes in and breaks apart these fat droplets and gives these fat droplets lots of surface area. These are still triglycerides. These are not broken down fats. These are still a fat. Then the enzyme from your pancreas, pancreatic lipase, comes along and breaks it down into our smallest versions of glycerol and fatty acid molecules. So this time, rather than being absorbed by active transport, we are actually absorbed by diffusion. Okay, so they're able to diffuse into the cell walls. And then what ends up happening is they're reorganized back into triglycerides. And rather than being passed into the bloodstream, they're passed into our lymph vessels or into our lacteals. You may remember lymph as lymphatic, which comes from when we talked about the immune system. Your lymph vessels run all over your body, and your fats actually get transported through your body in the lymph vessels. So they don't go to the bloodstream. They get stored in areas around your body through the lymph vessels. So let's take a quicker look at how this happens. So here's your amino acid tyrosine. What's going to happen is amino acid of tyrosine is too big to cross my channel here. It's too big. So imagine this is like a little pump here. And what happens is this pump gets activated by ATP. So this is the intestinal wall, or this is the villi that is capturing these amino acids. So ATP then is broken down into ADP, which releases energy. And this amino acid gets shuttled through active transport into the intestinal wall. So tyrosine is sitting in the intestinal wall. There's another pump that's waiting to be able to move it out through active transport into a blood capillary. So there's our blood capillary. So that is the movement or how things are absorbed into the blood cell. Amino acid, active transport into the small intestine, active transport to the blood capillary. Monosaccharides, such as glucose, same process. We have the intestinal wall, the villi are right there. We have the pump right here. We're going to use ATP to actively transport or pull glucose inside of our cells. Glucose is then going to be actively passed out into our blood capillary. Fatty acids and glycerols are a little different. Here I have fatty acids and glycerols. We're going to take this fatty acid, and then what happens is it's going to diffuse into the intestinal cell wall. So you'll notice this time I don't have a pump because I don't need active transport. So once it's in that intestinal wall, it's reorganized into fatty acids and glycerol, and you'll notice this is too big. It can't really figure out where it's going, so it can't fit into a blood capillary, so it's going to go into the lymphatic system or into a lacteal. Again, diffused across. So this is how we pass digested macromolecules into our circulatory system or our lymphatic system. Now there's a little bit more to this story. Just as a reminder, this is all happening in the jejunum. We've talked about the duodenum is digestion, jejunum is absorption, okay? So is the ileum, but we're going to say specifically the jejunum where most of the absorption occurs. Now there's a little bit more to this story about how things get passed from our stomach into the duodenum, because we just finished talking about how we absorb it, but how does food actually get passed from the stomach into the duodenum? It doesn't just like hit the stomach and then drop into your small intestine. So we're going to actually talk about some key hormones that play a role in your digestion. So these hormones are passed around your bloodstream because that's how hormones are passed, and they're produced by different areas of your body. So the first one we're going to talk about is gastrin. So gastrin is a hormone that is produced by the stomach. It's released from the stomach, and it's stimulated to be released when food is present in our stomach. That's what stimulus means, okay? It's triggered essentially. So it's released from the stomach. It's released from the stomach when food is present in our stomach. So the stretching of our actual stomach as we fill it with food is what stimulates gastrin to be released. The target for this hormone, so where is it going to, is still our stomach. And its response, its role of what it's supposed to do, is it's actually the reason we release hydrochloric acid and pepsin. So when we think back to how we digest food, we talked about how hydrochloric acid's job is to kind of tear apart food, especially breaking down polypeptides, just making them smaller. And pepsin is an enzyme that is actually digesting proteins in the stomach. The reason those get released, they're not just always hanging out there. The reason they get released in a large amount is because of this hormone gastrin. So it also, gastrin's job is to increase our stomach motility, so mechanical digestion. So it helps turn or churn the food within our stomach. Okay, so that's a big part of how we start digesting things in our stomach, is because the hormone gastrin helps. Now what happens is as your food is churned and as you break things down, as that process continues and comes almost to a completion, your body stops releasing gastrin. That's called a feedback loop, and that's something we're going to learn about in Bio 30. Another really key important hormone is called secretin. So you can see it's right here, okay, secretin. And secretin's source, it comes from the duodenum, and it is released, so secretin is released into our body when the food or the chyme from your stomach is released into the duodenum. So you have a little sphincter right here. It's a little doorway, okay? And it's always closed, because if it wasn't closed, then all the acid from our stomach would leak into our small intestine and eat away at our small intestine. Our stomach is specifically lined, a special lining to help stop that from happening. So what happens is when that door opens, okay, food gets dumped into our duodenum. How does it do that? Through the use of secretin. So it targets both the pancreas and the stomach. So you see it has two jobs here. So it's targeting the pancreas and the stomach. Its first job is to make sure that the pancreas releases bicarbonate. Okay, so here's our bicarbonate ion. Okay, bicarbonate is a base, and the food in our stomach is acidic because it's been sitting in hydrochloric acid. So you know when a base and an acid come together, they create neutralization. So it becomes neutral. So first we have to release this bicarbonate ion to make sure that all the acidic chyme coming into our duodenum is not going to burn it. The second thing it does is it stops and it makes sure that all of those releases are stopped. So gastrin started it. Secretin tells gastrin to stop. So it stops the motility, it stops the pepsin release, and it stops the hydrochloric acid release. The third hormone we're going to talk about is CCK. Now, CCK has a really long name that I have a really hard time pronouncing, so we keep it to just CCK. So again, its source, or where it's going to, is the duodenum, and it is also stimulated because the stomach releases food into your duodenum. It has three targets this time. It has a pancreas target, a gallbladder target, and a stomach target, so it's going to all three. So what is it doing? In the pancreas, CCK's job is to tell all of those enzymes, pancreatic amylase, pancreatic lipase, trypsin, chymotrypsin, hey, you need to leave the pancreas and go do your job. So it's released into the duodenum. It also goes to the gallbladder and it says, hey, gallbladder, we got a lot of fats here. You need to go and you need to help digest those lipids. So CCK tells the gallbladder to release the bile so that you can digest lipids. And it also tells the stomach to stop passing food from it into the duodenum. So it's like, hey, we have enough, close that sphincter door. We don't need any more. So CCK has a really huge role in regulating the enzymes in our body, as well as making sure that our stomach stops passing food into our small intestine. So CCK and secretin are there to slow the movement of the stomach for two reasons. So it said slow motility. We want to, one, make sure that everything that's in our stomach doesn't just drop into our small intestine. Because you have to remember, you eat breakfast, you eat lunch, you eat dinner. If you ate breakfast and you ate a good breakfast and it takes a while for that to digest, and then you just had a chocolate bar for lunch, okay, your body's not going to be fully done digesting that chocolate bar before it starts passing things into the duodenum. So it wants to make sure that not everything that's in the stomach leaves at once. It also is there because when things are harder to digest, so if you're eating something that is a very complex carbohydrate or something, or not a carbohydrate, but a protein or something like that, your stomach wants to keep it, we want to keep it in there a little bit longer to get broken down just a little bit more. So we keep it in there for a longer period of time, okay? Both these hormones enable fatty meals to remain in the stomach longer than non-fatty meals. So if you think about if you ate a meal full of fats, it's going to stay in the stomach a little bit longer, okay? The CCK also stimulates the pancreatic release of enzymes, which I talked about, and secretin is releasing bicarbonate, to neutralize chyme. So I talked about a lot. I talked about absorption. I talked about hormones. You might want to go back and review and make sure all your notes are filled in. And if you have any questions, please let me know.